Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So, what we want to do today is just talk a little about what happened over the weekend. What does it mean for the sectors that we cover, and what does it mean for your portfolio? Now, I think I'm not going to go through the process of Biden dropping out of the race and so forth like that, but I want to talk about what happens now. So, there's a couple of catalysts and a couple of things to note before we go to the Democratic convention, which is scheduled in Chicago for August 22nd. Now, let me stress that Vice President Kamala Harris is not the nominee. She is not the nominee for the presidency yet. She has not been confirmed to be the nominee. But and NBC News actually said that it is almost like a coronation. And I like that term because we've seen a lot of people from, the Congressional Black Caucus to the Service Workers Union to Senator Dick Durbin to a whole host of individuals up on Capitol Hill come already out and endorse her, along with the endorsement of President Biden. So for today's purposes, I'd like to, just for these analysts and I to talk about, we are going to talk about under the presumption that this is Vice President Kamala Harris who is going to be the nominee. Now, we're not also going to talk about whether or not she has a chance of winning versus President Trump or not. If you have a terminal, please go to WSL Election Go, and you can see all the prediction markets there and the data there. But for us, we like to conduct scenario analysis. We like to conduct what happens if this scenario takes place and what happens if this scenario takes place. So, as we go into Chicago and we go into the convention, it's looking like the Chicago convention is going to be a little bit less controversial, a little bit more calmer, if you will. I don't think you're going to see this idea of a broker convention. The reason being is, don't forget, the state of Ohio requires, and I know there's some legal aspects over the exact timing of this, but for the purposes of getting the ballot or the nominee onto the ballot in the state of Ohio, that decision has to be made by about August 7th. So prior to this, there was this idea that Democrats were going to hold a virtual roll call, if you will, dust off that COVID playbook, and essentially nominate President Biden to be the nominee for president for the state of Ohio. Now, obviously, now that President Biden is no longer on the ballot, that process still has to continue, and it most likely will happen with Kamala Harris being the nominee. So don't be surprised around August 1st if you see the Democrats come out and say that we need to hold this virtual roll call in order to get Vice President Harris on the Ohio ballot. If that moves forward, it takes about a week, but if that process were to move forward and it happens, then Kamala Harris, I think, would most likely just be the nominee in waiting at the convention. So the other thing to keep in mind is that we really haven't seen anybody else other than Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia flirt with the idea of challenging her. And Senator Manchin even just said this morning that he wasn't going to run. So I'm not exactly sure that anybody else out there is really actively considering it. I'm sure people are saying, "Hey, do we have an opportunity here?" But I think Kamala Harris will be the nominee. Her vice presidential pick, though, is also important. But I would just stress here is that she has plenty of time in order to do this. She's going to do it at a time in which she thinks it's most politically advantageous to her. And remember, she may not even have to do this until the convention itself. President Trump didn't pick Vice President Pence until the actual first day of the convention. So, there is plenty of time here. There are 4 names that I have heard, and I please just stress that I am a Washingtonian. So these are the names that I've heard in Washington. And this would be Governor Bashar out of Kentucky, Governor Shapiro out of Pennsylvania, Governor Cooper out of North Carolina, and as almost as a dark horse candidate, Senator Kelly from Arizona. Now, there are plenty of other candidates out there that I think are being discussed, but just wanted to give you a flavor of what I'm hearing in Washington. But back to Kamala Harris, we're going to proceed as if she's the nominee. So my colleagues and I are going to run through our sectors. We're going to talk about what we think is the most important things to keep in mind. And then we'll get back to talk a little bit about J.D. Vance and Trump, just because I think it's important to call out on that. And then we'll get to your Q&A. So the first thing I want to talk about before I hand it over to Andrew to talk about taxes, I want to talk about financials. So the idea here is, how does Vice President Harris differ from President Biden when it comes to financial policy? And I said even on the TV this past weekend when I did a hit, that when President Biden came into office, it felt to me that President Biden's policies geared over the last 4 years to where Kamala Harris was, rather than Kamala Harris policies gearing more towards Biden's policies. And so I think there's going to be a lot of regulatory status quo, with one exception, and that is on consumer financial protection heroes. because when Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California, she participated with a whole host of other states, I think it was all but two, including the District of Columbia, on a $25 billion settlement on home foreclosure issues against the big banks, so Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera. And I think that as her time as Attorney General showed, that there was a lot of emphasis on low to middle income consumers and consumer protections and so forth. And so I would just, under a Kamala Harris presidency, I certainly would anticipate that to happen more and more, specifically at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and maybe even a little bit more different at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So I'm going to talk about financials now, but Andrew, can you give us your thoughts on taxes? Because I know you put out quite a bit of two notes in particular just on Friday and today talking about this scenario.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. The quote that keeps coming to mind over the past couple of days, last week, I guess, is that there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And I think that's where we are right now. So I'm just speaking purely from a tax perspective here. But I think that the message regarding Kamala, and maybe it's just initial, but I think the message has been that she's essentially Biden, but younger and female. And I think that even if that was the case and she inherits, all of his policies and that's what she's going to go with, I think a lot of times when a vice president becomes the president, they, at least for tax purposes, come up with a different strategy than their predecessor. So, for example, Lyndon Johnson enacted one of the largest tax increases in U.S. history during his presidency. His predecessor Kennedy had dramatically reduced taxes. Reagan famously cut taxes twice, and George H.W. Bush just as famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then increased taxes. So, do people change, from where they were before and where they end up during the presidency? Sure. Like, Nixon in 1960 was different than Nixon in 1968. But so, where has Kamala been on taxes? Well, as a senator, and when she ran for president, she's pretty left of center, if not progressive. She proposed a refundable tax credit for home rental payments. She wanted to provide assistance to low-income taxpayers for help filling out their taxes. She wanted to give small businesses just in lower income communities assistance during COVID. And she talked about a financial transaction tax, a tax on pharmaceutical companies, and a tax on banks. She also said that she wants to fully repeal Trump's Tax Act. And if you look at the bills that she signed on to while she was a senator, the two senators that she most frequently sponsored tax bills with, when she was a senator, were Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So, and this is just tax, mind you, but she was fairly progressive as a senator. And remember that she, during the 2020 campaign also advocated for Medicare for all, and she was going to pay for that by raising $2 trillion worth of taxes on the top 1% through payroll taxes, raising the capital gains rate, and introducing a new financial transaction tax. But I think Democrats have actually moved a little bit more to the center since the 2020 election, and maybe even from the time that she was a senator. So, for example, Democrats, rather than wanting to raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 35%, they want to raise it to 24.5%. Biden actually wants to raise it to 28%, and they advocate for a more generous child tax credit. They advocate for expanding the low-income housing tax credit. So I think, those are things that she's probably going to incorporate into her platform when she introduces it. And then just if I could pivot just for 5 minutes to talk about J.D. Vance as well, I think just as Kamala Harris isn't sort of a duplicate of Biden, I think that Vance is not a duplicate of Trump. So he's not I think arch conservative that people are making him out to be. So I think in fact he's a lot more populist than that, at least on tax issues. So he said he wants to repeal EV tax credits, but then replace them with tax credits for gas powered cars instead. He wants to raise taxes on wealthy universities' endowments, but he wants to use that money to pay for non-college workforce training. He wants to disallow wealthy corporations from being able to do tax-free mergers and acquisitions. And interestingly, this is a bill that he joined Sheldon Whitehouse on, one of the most progressive senators in the Senate. And he supports removing the gun excise tax from applying to silencers, but he hasn't joined a broader bill to get rid of the gun tax altogether. So he wants to keep it in place. And interestingly, the senator with whom he has co-sponsored bills most frequently is a Democrat. That's Sherrod Brown, the other Ohio senator. So Vance, not as conservative as people are making him out to be, and I think that Vice President Harris, at least from her past record, is a lot more liberal than Biden, and more liberal, I think, than people are making her out to be. So that's my take.
So Andrew, real quick, because we have you, I've often said that the election is really, there's two major impacts of this election, and that is tariffs and taxes. And the taxes, there's going to be a substantial debate next year because, correct me if I'm wrong, the Trump era tax cuts for individuals expires at the end of 2025. So how do you see that process playing out under both a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency? And also probably just including, is there a reconciliation angle there if President Trump wins, the Republicans win the House and the Senate? What's the timing, I guess the best way to say it? What's the timing of the of tax reform?
ASAP. Yeah. Because like you said, everything sort of expires at the end of 2025. There is a bill that's pending in the Senate right now that would extend some of those changes to 2027, and maybe the Democrats will move on that. The House has already passed it. Maybe the Democrats in the Senate will want to move on that if they think maybe they're not going to get the number of seats that they want in the Senate or in the House. But everything sort of depends on the outcome of the November election in terms of how many seats the Republicans can win in the House, how many seats they can win in the Senate. To know whether or not you're going to be able to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or make it permanent. And I think with regard to reconciliation, certainly if the Republicans can't get 60 seats in the Senate, then they're going to have to rely on reconciliation in order to get the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act through. That's how they got it passed in the first place. Now, the issue with that is, of course, that it sunsets, which is why we're in this situation in the first place. So it all depends on how many votes they get in Congress, and to some extent that may be connected with the coattails of whomever wins the presidency. But yeah, I mean, if Harris wins the presidency, presumably the Democrats are going to have a good night in terms of the House and Senate too. And who knows, on the Republican side, I think it's more likely to be a mixed bag. But if they win big, then you're gonna see them hop on tax reform absolutely immediately and try to get as much of the tax act made permanent as they possibly can. And if they can't make it permanent, then extending it as long as they possibly can.
Sounds good. And for the folks, when we mention reconciliation, we're saying there's a process that Congress can use to effectively bypass the filibuster in the Senate by passing a resolution once per fiscal year. And this is how Obamacare got through. This is how President Trump's tax cuts got through. This is how the Inflation Reduction Act got through. You can't alter what's known as the Byrd Rule. I'm not going to go through the Byrd Rule. Honestly, we could go through that for an hour, but that's what we're talking about. Lastly, I'm going to turn to Justin next, but I just saw a red line on the terminal. The Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker just endorsed Kamala Harris, so that was another individual who has 2028 hopes that has endorsed Kamala Harris. So just again makes it much more likely that she's going to be the nominee. So, Justin, let's turn to you. Can you give us an update? You've been looking a lot on electric vehicles, Tesla and Rivian, all the fun companies that I wish I could cover. But anyway, can you give us a lot of thoughts on what you're thinking in this space? Justin, you're think the technology has it on Zoom. It may be having you talk about something else. So let's go ahead and give you a second and see if that works. No. Okay, Justin, I'm going to do that time old thing. I'm going to turn it to Rob, and we're going to come back to you. Sorry about that. So, Rob Barnett. Oh, Justin, can you lower your mic just real quick and see if that works? The mic on the side of your head. Oh, we just lost him. Okay, Rob, let's talk about energy. You and I have had multiple conversations about renewables because, we did this big note on the elections, but we also did this big note on the Inflation Reduction Act. And we just talked about the Reduction Act. You've been looking at this sector quite a bit. You've been looking at Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think Kamala Harris probably represents, in many ways, status quo for energy policy. I've gone back and forth with you over the years, Nathan. Why did they call the Inflation Reduction Act that by that name? I still don't know. I think maybe it had something to do with preferences from Joe Manchin, but the IRA should be called the sort of, the Clean Energy Provision Bill or something like that. And this is a pretty profound piece of legislation for the equipment suppliers in the U.S. that are making solar panels, wind turbines, things like that. And my general view is that this policy is probably safe under a Kamala Harris presidency. It would have been safe under a re-election of Biden. Any Democrat, I doubt this policy gets tinkered with. It's pretty profound because we've seen a massive surge in spending on clean energy manufacturing in the U.S., and it really is happening across the geography of the U.S. So it's occurring in red states, blue states, and you've got companies like First Solar that have been expanding their manufacturing footprint. Very interesting. A German company called Meyer Burger, which was kind of the sole solar equipment manufacturing company that was still existing in Europe. Most of the solar supply chains in China has basically picked up shop and moved over here to the U.S. And you've got Korean company like Hanwha building manufacturing supply chain in the U.S. So, if the IRA does get tinkered with, which is probably much more likely under a Republican outcome, it could be pretty significant for these kinds of companies. They're all sort of lining up to take advantage of this 45X manufacturing tax credit. And, company like First Solar, not to harp on them too much, but they're running at about a 45% gross margin because of these tax provisions. You strip out the tax provisions, see gross margin fall to something like 20%. So still positive, but 45% much better than 20% if you're looking at the financials for any of these names. And then maybe just the last piece on the idea of a Kamala Harris presidency is, nobody knows for sure, but I think at least if you think back to 2020 timeframe and primary against Biden, there was some sense that Kamala could perhaps be a little bit tougher on the oil and gas industry. And so when you start to think about things like LNG permitting, upstream regulation, that kind of thing, perhaps a little bit more onerous under a Harris presidency.
Great. So one thought I had though, just on energy, since we have you, President Trump spent a lot of time in his RNC speech using the words "drill, baby, drill." And, one of the things that the energy, so full disclosure, Rob and I had a chat going on during the RNC, and we were talking about this. And I said, Rob, is drill baby drill actually ever going to happen if President Trump were to win? And so, Rob, I want to ask you that question. Can you tell us, does drill baby drill actually happen, or are we talking about a market that is already left the sale? Or I'm trying to pick a bad metaphor. Is drill baby drill actually happen?
Well, so arguably, drill baby drill has been happening under both Democratic and Republican presidents over the last couple of decades here in the U.S. We are still seeing a continuation of the hydraulic fracturing, shale, oil and gas boom here in the U.S. And one of the things that tickles me to death, because I've been working in the energy space for a couple decades now, is that when you look at North America, you look at US plus Canada, and let's throw in Brazil as well. So kind of three countries, Canada, US, Brazil. The oil and gas production is roughly equivalent to OPEC right now. And so, we when you think about oil markets, OPEC is always the sort of elephant in the room. And because the U.S. has grown its production footprint so much, we now rival them. The U.S. is the world's largest oil and gas producer, in case that's unknown. And that has unfolded under a Democratic president. So I find it hard to believe that we would really see a big shift in kind of the U.S. Production profile under a Democrat or a Republican, even though under a Democratic president, we're probably going to have loftier goals around what 2030 or what 2050 look like in terms of emissions and where those things could head. But I doubt we will see a big upswing or downswing in terms of U.S. Oil and gas production, independent of who the president is.
Sounds good. So, Justin, let's try it. Let's go back to you for electric vehicles. Any other thoughts you have?
Yeah, definitely. Nothing like a few tech issues on a Monday morning. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think piggybacking what Rob was saying about the IRA, there's certain tax credits that were included under the IRA related to electric vehicles that we think very likely continue under a Harris administration if that was to happen. So just kind of dialing it back a little bit, there was a $7,500 personal income tax credit for the purchase of a new electric vehicle, a little bit less for a used electric vehicle. But we think what might happen here is there could be a little bit of a repackaging issue about how those issues are presented under a new Harris campaign. And when I say that, what I mean is that I think there's been a recognition recently of waning consumer sentiment around the issue of electric vehicles, and really in the sense that maybe there needs to be more of a focus on expanding charging capabilities related to EVs and talking about the infrastructure out there for nationwide charging of EVs versus an actual push to require folks to purchase an electric vehicle. It's been a really hot campaign issue on the right. Certainly folks talking about really harnessing that negative feeling, if you will, around being forced to purchase an electric vehicle or any policy that might look that way to a voter right now. Also rising at this time is this anti-China rhetoric we've been seeing in terms of electric vehicles, mainly due to the fact that China is the largest manufacturer worldwide of both electric vehicles and the components that go into the cars. So even cars that are rolled out here in the United States, a lot of those components originate in China. So there is this rhetoric now, especially from the right, where we're seeing a conversation saying, hey, wait a minute, even though we might be looking to benefit the environment here, this is really a boon to the Chinese economy. So this is all, I think, front and center for how this campaign continues to roll out around this issue. A bit of a thorny issue in the sense that there was this emissions rule that was finalized by the EPA a couple months back. And though that rule was certainly watered down in the sense that even though two-thirds of electric vehicles will still be required, two-thirds of vehicles sold by 2032 will still be required to be electric, it's now electric in some capacity. It's not this bright line kind of harsh rule that was originally proposed by the EPA. I think that's a recognition that charging capabilities aren't quite there yet to the extent they should be. And it also gives American car manufacturers some time to comply with that rule. They're not all really set up yet to roll these vehicles off their assembly lines the way that kind of would be necessary to comply by 2032. So that's something to consider here. We think the policy itself is largely unchanged. It's really a question of how that policy is packaged to the voter right now as it rolls out the next couple of months. So that's really the focus on EVs. Just also been taking a quick look here at antitrust issues, and particularly through the lens of enforcement. I know Jen's going to speak a little bit more about merger activity, but looking back to Kamala Harris's time as Attorney General in California, it really has been enormously helpful to kind of see what she did there and how that might apply to federal policy if she were elected. So first and foremost, I think it's safe to say that Vice President Harris, when she was serving as the AG, really used the antitrust power she had as the AG in California to take on healthcare and purported cost issues related to healthcare while she was serving there. So she led a group of states to oppose a merger between a hospital and a group of physicians' practices, so a vertical consolidation issue there. And then also she joined a DOJ lawsuit that was ultimately successful in stopping a merger between Anthem and Cigna. So really a focus here on healthcare. I think what that means is that these investigations that we've seen underway already in the healthcare space, there was an announcement by our news reported last week that the FTC is preparing a complaint right now into pharmacy benefit managers owned by Cigna, CVS Health, and United Health. Those things kind of continue. We don't see those really going away under a Harris administration if that were to happen. DOJ, it's also been reported, is investigating United Health for its vertical consolidation issues. And when I say that, what I mean is pharmacy benefit managers, the insurance capabilities, the patient data issue providers, all of those are now kind of combined under one roof at United Healthcare. And it's really similar to those vertical consolidation issues that Kamala Harris was looking into while she was serving as AG in California. So a lot of similarity there between what's on the table at the federal level now and what she saw as state AG a few years ago in California. A lot of interest, obviously, in big tech as well. Look, it's been widely reported that Senator Kamala Harris had these deep relationships with big tech, but I don't think that's necessarily surprising. She is from the Bay Area. I think it'd be odd if she had been a senator from California and didn't have relationships with the companies that were really at the backbone of the state's economy, right? So I think that's something to consider moving forward. But look, the cats, I think, are also out of the bag here in the sense that there are trials coming up here, the main example of that really being that Google ad tech monopolization case that's slated for trial in September. That's not going away. And we saw last month that there's investigations being reported in the AI space now related to NVIDIA and its status as the largest kind of semiconductor provider in that space, and also things like Microsoft's investment in OpenAI, right? And whether that kind of is a control issue in terms of consolidation around AI itself. So, we're really seeing those issues there. They're already underway. They're not something that we think could be dialed back in any way. And, even though things might be a little bit more measured from the White House under a Harris administration, the bipartisan animus, if you will, against big tech from an antitrust perspective, it continues to grow on Capitol Hill. So I think all of that being what it is, all of that kind of stays unchanged moving into a Harris administration if it were to happen.
Sounds good. That's great stuff. I'm actually going to take this point to pause and just say, remember, folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. We have one question now. We'll get to that at the Q&A, but we certainly want to make sure that when you end this call, you have all the information that you need to go back to your day job. So I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne Wright. He is our senior healthcare policy analyst. Dwayne put out a note both Friday and last night, and one of the things that Dwayne wrote that really stuck out to me was Kamala Harris as president would likely boost Obamacare and the Inflation Reduction Act, which are probably two of the most significant Democratic initiatives over the last 10 years. And so, Dwayne, I just want you to just talk us through your note, talk us through what you're thinking on this.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Thanks for having me. So I think the way to look at a potential Harris campaign and a Harris administration is building on what's already been done already. So let's think about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, where we are now, 21.3, probably higher than that, million people enrolled just in the marketplace, millions more through Medicaid expansion. Part of that is because when we think about some of the COVID-related bills that were signed into law under Biden, the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act they call them enhanced, meaning providing more value for the individual by, say, reducing the premiums to pretty much nothing or capping what you'd have to pay, what an individual would have to pay in terms of premium versus income. those were time limited, extended under the Inflation Reduction Act, but they expire at the end of 2025. And the expectation is when we think about how the Congress might align in terms of the dynamics, a Republican Congress is probably going to do away with those subsidies or the enhanced subsidies. And federal projections suggest a drop, a 1-year drop of about 4 million people in Obamacare. So that would hit some of these companies like Centene, United Health, CVS Health, who have expanded their marketplace presence. So what will we expect from Harris? Well, to make sure that those subsidies remain in place, either get extended permanently or get extended 2 years, 3 years, what have you. As a whole, we're looking at about 25 billion to 30 billion worth in potential revenue that would be lost from the sector if these subsidies go away. Not an insignificant amount of money. So we expect her to continue to build on the past and make sure those premiums stay there. On the IRA, drug pricing, right now there's a process in place for the first set of 10 drugs to have price cuts, which could be 50% off of the net prices. We'll see 15 more drugs get picked 2025, implemented in 2027. By the end of 2028, 40 drugs will be subject to negotiated pricing. We see a Harris administration as essentially a continuation of what the Biden administration did and making sure that doesn't get pared back. Now, of course, we think there's opportunities for tweaks to the law, and that largely depends on what Congress looks like in terms of who's in control of the House and the Senate. But we really do see a continuation of that. And it is interesting that as a candidate, Harris did support a policy that would tie drug prices to prices paid overseas. It's called International Price Index. This was part of her platform in 2019 and 2020. Oddly enough, it was also something President Trump tried to do towards the tail end of his administration. Would she try and do that as part of her administration? It's possible as a bolt-on. I think, from my perspective, a Trump administration, and it's worth noting, Trump supported negotiation as a candidate in 2016, opposed it as president 2016 to 2020. Has not said he would repeal it, but I could see a scenario where he thinks he's the master negotiator and will get better prices for consumers than a Biden or a Harris administration. We could also see him revisit his policy of tying drug prices to those overseas. So I think those are some potential scenarios that might build on the Affordable Care Act. And I should go back to the ACA in terms of Trump. When we think about where he's been and where he is, came within one vote of repealing the ACA in, I believe that was 2017. Over the past 12 months, he said he wants to repeal it. He's also said he doesn't want to repeal it. He wants to make it better, but he hasn't outlined what better is and better for whom. If it's better for the taxpayer, it probably means fewer people enrolled. If it's better for the individual, it might mean they pay less in premiums, but that also means more tax dollars. So unclear where the president, President Trump would go. I would say that if he's in the White House and Republicans have control of Congress, we can expect those enhanced subsidies to go away. Bigger picture, will the ACA go away as a whole? Probably not. And so I think we'll see a lot of talk about where to go on healthcare over the coming weeks and months.
No, that's great insight, Dwayne. Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen Reed to talk a little bit more about antitrust because, with more of the JD Vance angle, I mean, we have this idea of economic populism that is really just in the news cycle, this idea. And I've said it before, you can't just go under the old stereotypical Republicans equal good for big business. It's a little bit more complex than that. And Jen's done a lot of work on Senator Vance and Lena Khan. We had an event here at the Bloomberg office just a few months ago where Senator Vance called Lena Khan a great pick for President Biden. So, Jen, can you just give us your thoughts on big tech, antitrust, anything that you could see under a Trump administration?
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. I agree with you. I mean, I think a Trump Vance ticket is so interesting with respect to antitrust because I believe it'll really turn sort of the old orthodoxy about a Republican administration and how they treat antitrust on its head. Because for years and years and years, and let me just say generally that the past is no longer the best predictor of the future with respect to antitrust in any way. And for years, the general consensus has been that when we have a Republican administration, they're going to be more business friendly than the Democratic administrations. Take a lighter touch, more deals will get through. Now, this is for a different discussion. I don't actually see it that way. If you really dig into the data and the stats, particularly with respect to M&A, you'll see that it's really just incremental, that there's a slight uptick, a slightly lighter touch with Republicans versus Democrats. But today, what we have is a completely atypical and quite aggressive approach by Biden's antitrust decision makers at the FTC and DOJ, particularly with respect to deals. Both leaders at the FTC and DOJ believe that most industries have become too consolidated and that instead of working to allow a deal to get through with a remedy, they should really just be trying to stop all sorts of consolidation. And they've been using their merger control power under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act to do that. For the last 3.5 years, they've been suing to block a lot more deals than in the past. And they've also implemented numerous policies that just make the antitrust scrutiny process more difficult at the outset. And what this done is put a real damper on deal making. And it's also led to a very large number of abandonments, far more than we've had in the past, meaning deals that got signed up, they started to go through the process and said, can't do it, it'll take too long, too many resources, we're just going to walk away. So given that current atmosphere, if we had a typical Republican administration take over in January, it would be a significant change. And I think there are some today in the business world that are kind of looking forward to that and sort of see that happening again. But as Nathan pointed out, there's nothing typical GOP about a Trump Vance ticket, and I don't really think that's going to happen. You know, we've seen J.D. Vance come out as a populist, come out as anti-big business, and expressly approve of what Lena Khan, who's the current chair of the FTC, has been doing. So if we see that Vance influences Trump in this area, I don't think very much is going to change in terms of the approach to deal making, keeping those hurdles up in front of deals, and continuing to sue to try to block deals, particularly in the tech world and with respect to companies that are already fairly big in their industry. Now, bear in mind that a lot depends on who is nominated and appointed at the FTC and at the DOJ, because those are the main antitrust decision makers. And at least one current Republican commissioner, newly appointed by Biden, has shown herself in some of her statements to be a little bit more of a typical Republican in the way we think of the Republican approach to mergers and to antitrust. So just a few really quick words about the monopolization lawsuits against the big tech platforms. Completely agree with Justin. No matter who wins in this November and takes over in January, I don't think anything changes. I mean, as a refresher, we have the FTC that sued Amazon and Meta. We have the DOJ that has 2 lawsuits against Google and 1 against Apple. I see them as continuing. All of these investigations started under the previous Trump administration, and the lawsuit against Meta was actually filed under the previous Trump FTC. There is animus toward big tech. Trump is not a friend to big tech, and neither is J.D. Vance, and neither really is Kamala Harris. She has supported the Biden administration aggressively approach here. So I think everything just continues as it's been.
Sounds good. So let's go to some Q&A, and to my fellow panelists, please jump in if you want to add anything. I'm just going to read some of the questions we've gotten. Are there any specific budget or fiscal shifts that can be expected with the Harris versus Biden? And you know what? I think Andrew sort of hinted at this in his remarks, is the idea of reconciliation, because gridlocked Congress usually means that you don't get broad bills through. When you have a gridlocked Congress, there's 2 avenues the legislation gets through. One is you have must-pass pieces of legislation, like the debt ceiling. For what it's worth, the debt ceiling expires in January 2025 during the lame duck, so I don't think that's going to be an issue. They'll kick the can further into 2025. So you have these must-pass pieces of legislation, or you have reconciliation. And so, it really depends, I think, for a Harris or Biden or a Trump presidency. Do they have the House and do they have the Senate with them? And look, I think the polling suggests the Democrats' chance of having a reconciliation opportunity isn't there. Like Andrew said, they would have to have a very good night. But it really, in terms of broad fiscal, multi-trillion-dollar spending bills or tax incentives or tax cuts, really comes with the eye of reconciliation. So I'm not sure if anybody else wants to opine on that, but that's the answer that I was thinking off the top of my head. So, okay, so let's go to the next question. Is Harris winning the Dem nomination a done deal, or is there a real possibility of another candidate entering the race? Look, it's Washington. Anything can happen. I'll say that, I view this as like, and I apologize to the folks, I'm a Chicago Bears fan. I view this as sort of like Caleb Williams, who's the #1 draft pick. He did great at USC. He was a great quarterback, but now he's in the NFL. And we don't know how he's going to play in the NFL. I personally think he's going to lead us to the Super Bowl in 3 years, but we don't know how he's going to he's going to play in the NFL. And it's similar with, I think, Vice President Kamala Harris. She was the vice president, but now she is the presidential nominee, anticipated presidential nominee. She's the one that has to go out there today, tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all the way for the next, until the Democratic convention, and really show herself to the American populace. And the lights are going to be on her, and she's going to have to perform. So I think winning that, I don't want to ever say it's a done deal until it's a done deal, but I think the odds favor her, certainly. So I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that.
I think for her not to, we'd have to think about, okay, who else would want it and get it? The most likely candidates have basically said they're either endorsing Kamala Harris or they're not going to challenge her. And that's Newsom, Whitmer, Shapiro, Ray Cooper, and I'm sure there are others. So who is that person if it's not Harris? I'm sure a lot of people would like to see Obama come back, but that's just not possible. So at the end of the day, who is the person, and based on the rules, who can get enough ballots? I think you need something like 300 delegates to support getting onto the ballot to challenge or to create an open convention. Who is that person that's going to do it? Given the way some of the state delegations have already come forward for Vice President Harris, I believe she already has over 500, which is about a quarter of the delegates she needs to secure the nomination. It's unclear who that other person is that's willing to step forward, especially when you think about the fact that those who would have the best chance are probably already thinking about 2028.
Great. So let's go to a couple more questions. Andrew, I'm presuming that we have a lot of New York and New Jersey folks on this call. And if you live in New York and New Jersey, you know about the SALT deduction. And I want to ask you, Andrew, is there any relief for the SALT deduction coming back for those folks?
Well, it comes back automatically in 2026, but my personal view is that if the Republicans get a large enough majority, that they're going to get rid of it completely. But I know that's really terrible for all of us living in the Northeast, but I think that's certainly a possibility, because I mean, if they're going to make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, or if they're going to reduce the corporate tax rate to 20% or 15%, they're going to need a lot of revenue, and in order to do that, they're going to have to kill some sacred cows, and I think that's #1 on the list.
Do you think under a Harris presidency, because she's from California, she would be a little bit more in tune to provide that relief to those states?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, if Harris becomes president, I think it expires on its own. The cap goes away. The same with the mortgage interest deduction. It'll go right back up to $1 million. I think that she would just let those things expire naturally, and everything would go back to normal. But I don't know that in the future the Republicans won't go back to this as a pot of money that they can take for other policy positions that they have. Now that they've already gone there, I think that it's now an open question whether they'll go back again.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Andrew. I just presumed there were a lot of folks from New York and New Jersey on this call, and I want to make sure that they get all the information on that, because I know it's important. So a couple other questions we have. Does the lame duck presidency have any potential impact on the efforts to repropose the Basel III Endgame? So the Basel III Endgame, as you may know, is an FDIC, OCC, and Fed proposal to raise capital requirements. Initially, it was be around 19%. Our estimation is around 7 to 10%. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell just came out in Senate Banking and House Financial Services Committee testimony just earlier this month and said they're going to repropose elements of it. It's not going to be a full reproposal, but they're going to repropose elements of that. The thought at the time is that was going to come out in September. And if that reproposal comes out, look, if it comes out in September, if it even comes out in October or November, even if it were to come out today, they're not going to be able to finalize it until after the elections and after January 20th of 2025. I would be insanely shocked if the regulators were to do this and finalize the Basel III endgame before January 20th under a Biden presidency. So I don't think the lame duck really has much into play in the Basel III endgame. I think the ship has already sailed, and I think that it's really going to be, is President Trump going to negate the rule, or is it going to be President Harris from moving this forward? And I should also just state for those of you listening, we haven't even been talking about the court cases and the impact of Chevron deference and the major equestrian doctrine on a lot of stuff that's going on with this. We have a separate report on that, so please contact us on that. And just because that's going to be a big, significant impact on courts over the next few years. So Rob, I want to turn it to you. I got a question on energy here. Is the IRA or trade tariffs, because we haven't talked about President Trump's 60% tariffs on things from China, is the IRA or trade tariffs more important for clean energy manufacturing?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. One of the things I generally observe is that the paradigm of free trade really has seemed to come to an end in the U.S. I think the U.S. used to advocate generally for low trade barriers, and it seems that we've really come to a point, particularly in the energy domain, where maybe that's no longer true. I think all things being equal, IRA is probably the more important factor. But even before the IRA existed, you had First Solar, longstanding manufacturer in the U.S. that has essentially been protected by trade policy. And for anyone who's unaware, roughly 80% of the solar supply chain sits in China right now. And so when you think about the IRA and some of the trade policy that's out there, I think the U.S. made a somewhat conscious decision to say, hey, look, we want clean energy to be built out in the U.S., but we don't want all the equipment manufactured in China. And in some ways, that might actually be a continued to have some support under a potential Trump administration. So let's see how it goes. But whether you think about the tariff situation or the IRA, both are positive. If you roll back IRA but keep the tariffs, you probably still have some U.S. manufacturing footprint, because even though it's cheaper to manufacture solar modules and other clean energy equipment in China, they are currently hit by some pretty substantial tariffs. And I surmise that it's likely that some of those things will exist no matter which way the presidency goes.
That sounds good. And Rob, when Rob was talking, he was talking about election scenarios. And I just wanted to use this moment to call out our election matrix. If you have a Bloomberg terminal, just go to BI laws, because we have scenario analysis. Because the way that we conduct policy analysis at BI is you have such a broad breadth of outcomes. And as time gets closer and closer and closer, those outcomes actually become more narrower. And so we just update our odds and our predictions and so forth based off of that. So Jen, I want to go to one more question for you, and then we'll send everybody back to their dates. The question is, why is all the money from big tech pouring into Republican coffers?
So I think there are two reasons for that. And I think one of them is the issue that the decision makers when it comes to these monopolization suits and when it comes to mergers are the folks at the DOJ and FTC, not necessarily a President Trump or a Vice President Vance. So despite the fact that Vance has been really clear that he believes Google should be broken up, if his Assistant Attorney General, whoever's appointed, which there is a greater likelihood that that appointee is more of a typical Republican, because J.D. Vance as a populist on antitrust sort of sits in a minority within the Republican Party, that would be the decision maker, and that would be the person or persons that would be discussing settlements with these companies to resolve some of these lawsuits. And so I think, if you have a Kamala Harris as president, you're going to keep the same people you have at the FTC and DOJ, likely. I should say. You're going to keep the same people who really aren't negotiating very much at all when it comes to settlements, whereas you have a shot at new people that may be more willing to negotiate, more willing to settle, and actually might take a lighter touch despite where the administration sits. And then the other thing could be the impact down ticket. There are a lot of bills that are pending in Congress now that would impact big tech and the way big tech operates. And if there's an influence down ticket with Trump and Vance winning that puts more, I'll say, typical Republicans into Congress, it's possible those bills have less of a chance of moving forward than if we have more Democrats in Congress. I don't know, Justin, do you agree with that, looking at it that way?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, the decision makers are the folks at the agencies, I think, and I think with the Harris administration, I think that's likely the case, that, maybe you see a
Right,
little bit of a swap out up top for leadership in the agencies, but you're right. I think the day-to-day operations really look to stay the same, and those are the folks having those discussions with
right.
targets, if you will.
Right. So the long and the short of it is big tech probably has a better shot with Trump Vance than they do with Harris, whoever.
Sounds good. So we will pause it there. I just want to say thank you everybody for attending. Please connect out. If you don't have a terminal, please connect with us on LinkedIn because we advertise a lot of these calls on LinkedIn, and you can certainly reach all of us there. And we just certainly would love any feedback that you may have. You can contact me at ndeen10@bloomberg.net, and I'll be happy to farm that out to the analysts. Or if you want to contact the analysts directly, again, we all have LinkedIn contacts. So I want to say thank you very much for your time. Wish you a great week, and thank you again. Take care.